Venezuela made a move, then this happened. Let me take you back to January 10, 2024. That's the day Venezuela's National Assembly, in a move that barely registered in Western headlines, unanimously approved a bill to annex a massive swath of neighboring Guyana, specifically the Essequibo region, an area larger than Greece, rich in oil, gold, and untapped mineral wealth. On paper, it looked like just another provocative stunt from Caracas, the kind of thing we've seen: saber-rattling, nationalist posturing, a desperate regime clinging to relevance. But here's the thing, this wasn't just another stunt. This was a calculated escalation, one with implications far beyond the Caribbean. And if you're only following the mainstream narrative, you're missing the real story. I've spent the last 3 decades studying Latin American geopolitics, first as a policy advisor in the State Department, later as a scholar tracking the slow-motion collapse of U.S. influence in its own backyard. What I'm about to tell you isn't speculation. It's the result of years of fieldwork, off-the-record conversations with diplomats, intelligence officials, and military planners, and a deep dive into the kind of data that rarely makes it into press releases. So let's start with the official story, the one they want you to believe. The official rogue regime's desperate gambit. On the surface, this looks straightforward. Venezuela, under Nicolas Maduro, is a failing state. Its economy has shrunk by 75% since 2013. Hyperinflation has rendered the bolivar worthless. Millions have fled, creating one of the worst refugee crises in the Western Hemisphere. And now, with elections looming and Maduro's approval ratings in the gutter, the regime is doing what authoritarian governments do when they manufacture a crisis to rally domestic support. The Essequibo dispute isn't new. Venezuela has claimed the region since the 19th century, when an 1899 arbitration award granted most of it to then British Guiana. Caracas has never fully accepted that ruling, but for decades, the issue was dormant. Then, in 2015, ExxonMobil discovered massive offshore oil reserves in Essequibo's waters. Guyana, now independent and backed by Western energy firms, began auctioning drilling rights. Venezuela, already isolated and sanctioned, saw its chance. In 2020, Maduro held a referendum where 95% of voters supported annexing Essequibo. Fast forward to January 2024, and the National Assembly makes it Essequibo is now Venezuelan territory. The U.S. response? Predictable. The State Department condemned the move as a violation of international law. The Pentagon sent a warship, the USS Burke, to conduct freedom of navigation exercises off Guyana's coast. The OAS issued a statement. The EU followed suit. Guyana, understandably alarmed, took the case to the International Court of Justice, which ruled in December 2023 that Venezuela must refrain from any action that would alter the status quo. Maduro, of course, ignored it. That's the story you've heard. A weak, isolated regime, lashing out to distract from its failures, met with the full diplomatic and military weight of the US and its allies. Case closed. Or is it? But here's the problem with this: it assumes Venezuela is acting alone. It assumes this is just about Maduro's survival. And it assumes the US response is purely defensive. None of those things are true. Deconstructing the what they're not telling you. Let's start with the timing. Why now? Venezuela has claimed Essequibo for over a century. Why escalate in 2024? The answer isn't just about elections. It's about oil, and not just any oil. The offshore fields in Essequibo's waters are some of the most lucrative in the world. Exxon's 2015 discovery was just the beginning. In 2023, Guyana's oil production surpassed 600,000 barrels per day, making it the fastest-growing oil economy on the planet. By 2027, it's projected to hit 1.2 million barrels per day, more than Norway. And here's the: most of that oil is controlled by Western firms Exxon, Hess, Chevron, with the US government's full backing. Now, ask if you were Maduro, watching your country's economy collapse while your neighbor strikes black gold, what would you do? You'd try to take a piece of it. But here's where it gets interesting. Venezuela doesn't have the military capacity to invade Guyana. It doesn't have the diplomatic leverage to force a negotiated settlement. And it certainly doesn't have the economic stability to absorb Essequibo's oil wealth without outside help. So why make the move now? Because Maduro isn't acting alone. And this isn't just about oil. In the weeks leading up to the National Assembly's vote, there were a series of high-level meetings that didn't make the news. In December 2023, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov visited Caracas. Officially, it was about strengthening bilateral ties. Unofficially, sources tell me, the conversation was about Essequibo. Then, in January, China's special envoy for Latin America, Xiao Xiaoqi, made an unannounced stop in Caracas. Again, no public statements. But here's what we do: China has been quietly extending its influence in Guyana, investing billions in infrastructure projects. And Russia? It's been Venezuela's primary arms supplier for years, and in 2023, it began delivering advanced S-300 air defense systems to Caracas, systems that could complicate any U.S. military intervention. Now, let's talk about the U.S. response. The Burke was sent to Guyana's waters, but it wasn't alone. The U.S. Southern Command has been conducting joint military exercises with Guyana for months. The Pentagon has quietly deployed special forces to train Guyanese troops. And in a little-noticed move, the U.S. has been pressuring Brazil, Guyana's southern neighbor, to allow American military access to its northern bases. Why? Because if Venezuela did try to take Essequibo by force, the U.S. would need a staging ground for a counteroffensive. But here's the part no one in Washington wants to: Venezuela isn't the only one playing this game. The U.S. has been encircling Venezuela for years. Sanctions, regime change operations, covert support for opposition groups, all of it designed to squeeze Maduro out. And now, with Guyana's oil boom, the U.S. has a new strategic interest in ensuring that oil stays in Western hands. So when Maduro makes his move, the U.S. response isn't just about defending Guyana. It's about sending a message to Russia: and this is our backyard. And that's where the real geopolitical chessboard comes into play. The extant geopolitical a new Cold War in the Caribbean. This isn't just about Venezuela and Guyana. It's about the broader struggle for influence in a multipolar world. Let me tell you something I've been warning about: for the U.S. is losing its grip on Latin America. And the powers that are filling the vacuum, Russia, China, even Iran, are playing a much smarter game than Washington. First, let's talk about Russia. Moscow has been Venezuela's lifeline for over a decade. When the U.S. imposed sanctions in 2019, Russia's Rosneft stepped in to keep Venezuela's oil flowing. When Maduro's regime was on the brink of collapse, Russian mercenaries from the Wagner Group helped prop it up. And now, with Essequibo, Russia sees an opportunity. If Venezuela can destabilize Guyana, it creates a crisis that forces the U.S. to divert resources from Ukraine or the Indo-Pacific. It's classic Cold War-era proxy bleed the hegemon by opening new fronts. Then there's China. Beijing has been methodically extending its influence in Latin America, not through military force, but through debt diplomacy and infrastructure investment. In Guyana, China has poured billions into ports, roads, and energy projects. Why? Because Guyana's oil is a strategic asset. If China can secure long-term supply contracts, it reduces its dependence on Middle Eastern oil that has to pass through U.S.-controlled choke points like the Strait of Malacca. And if Venezuela does manage to seize Essequibo, China gets a foothold in a region that the U.S. has long considered its exclusive sphere of influence. Now, let's talk about the U.S. response. The problem with American foreign policy in the 21st century is that it's stuck in a 20th century mindset. The U.S. still operates under the assumption that it can dictate terms to the rest of the world. That if it imposes enough sanctions, conducts enough military exercises, and issues enough sternly worded statements, other countries will fall in line. But that's not how the world works anymore. We're in a multipolar era now. The U.S. is still the strongest military power, but its economic and diplomatic leverage is eroding. China is the world's largest trading partner for most countries. Russia, despite its setbacks in Ukraine, remains a nuclear superpower with a veto at the UN Security Council. And in Latin America, the U.S. is no longer the only game in town. Countries like Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina are hedging their bets, playing Washington and Beijing off each other to extract the best deals. This is the context in which Venezuela's Essequibo gambit must be understood. Maduro isn't just a desperate dictator. He's a pawn in a much larger game, one where the US is trying to maintain its dominance, and Russia and China are working to erode it. And the Essequibo crisis is just the latest front in that struggle. Military and strategic, the illusion of a quick fix. Now, let's talk about the military dimension. Because if you listen to some of the hawks in Washington, you'd think this is a slam dunk. Venezuela is weak. Guyana is defenseless. The US could crush Maduro's forces in a week. But that's dangerously naive. First, let's look at the balance of forces. Venezuela's military is a shadow of what it was in the 1990s. Years of corruption, brain drain, and sanctions have hollowed it out. But it's not toothless. Venezuela has Russian-made Su-30 fighter jets, S-300 air defense systems, and a navy that, while outdated, could still pose a threat in coastal waters. More importantly, Venezuela has experience fighting asymmetrical wars. If the US were to intervene, it wouldn't be a conventional conflict. It would be a guerrilla war, with Venezuelan forces melting into the jungle and waging a protracted insurgency. Then there's the question of Russian and Chinese involvement. If the US were to launch a military operation against Venezuela, would Moscow and Beijing sit on the sidelines? Unlikely. Russia has already warned that any US intervention would be met with serious consequences. And China? It has economic leverage. Venezuela owes Beijing over $60 billion. If the US moves against Maduro, China could retaliate by dumping US Treasury bonds, triggering a financial crisis. And let's not forget the lessons of history. The US has a long track record of underestimating its adversaries in Latin America. The Bay of Pigs. The Contra War. The Iraq War. Afghanistan. Libya. In every case, the initial military operation was quick and decisive. But the aftermath? A quagmire. If the US intervenes in Venezuela, it won't be a surgical strike. It will be a long, bloody, and expensive conflict with no clear exit strategy. But here's the real: even if the US did succeed in removing Maduro, what then? Venezuela is a failed state. Its institutions are broken. Its economy is in ruins. The US would inherit a country on the brink of collapse, with no functioning government, no rule of law, and millions of desperate people. Sound familiar? It should. That's exactly what happened in Iraq after 2003. And we all know how that turned out. So when I hear policymakers in Washington talking about a quick and easy military solution, I want to scream. There is no quick and easy solution. There's only the illusion of one. The domestic political why this matters in an election year. Now, let's talk about the domestic angle. Because this isn't just about geopolitics. It's about politics, pure and simple. 2024 is an election year in the US. And in an election year, foreign policy becomes a political football. The Biden administration is under pressure from both sides. The left wing of the Democratic Party is pushing for a more restrained foreign policy, one that avoids military entanglements. The right, meanwhile, is accusing Biden of being weak on Venezuela, of letting Maduro get away with murder. And here's where it gets interesting. Florida is a swing state. And Florida has a large Venezuelan American population, over 300,000 people, many of whom fled Maduro's regime. For years, Venezuelan Americans have been a reliable Republican voting bloc. But in 2020, Biden made inroads with them by promising a tougher stance on Maduro. Now, with the Essequibo crisis, the administration has a chance to deliver on that promise. But if they overplay their hand, they risk alienating the progressive base. And if they underplay it, they risk losing Florida. So what's the play? The Biden administration is walking a tightrope. On one hand, they're sending warships and conducting military exercises to show strength. On the other, they're trying to avoid a direct confrontation. It's a delicate balancing act, and one that's being closely watched by both parties. But here's the: in an election year, Foreign policy decisions aren't made based on what's best for the country. They're made based on what's best for the campaign. And that's a dangerous game to play when the stakes are this high. Scenario: what comes next? So where does this go from here? Let me lay out 3 possible scenarios, along with their probabilities. Scenario 1: controlled escalation. In this scenario, Venezuela doesn't invade Guyana outright, but it doesn't back down either. Maduro continues to ratchet up the rhetoric, conducting military exercises near the border, harassing Guyanese fishing vessels, and maybe even seizing a small, uninhabited island in Essequibo's waters. The US responds with more sanctions, more military aid to Guyana, and more shows of force. Russia and China provide just enough support to keep Maduro afloat, but not enough to provoke a direct confrontation with the US. The crisis simmers, but it doesn't boil over. This is the most likely scenario, and it's the one that serves everyone's interests except Guyana's. Maduro gets to play the nationalist strongman without risking a full-scale war. The US gets to look tough without getting bogged down in another conflict. Russia and China get to exert their influence without triggering a US military response. And Guyana? It gets left holding the bag, forced to accept a de facto partition of its territory. Scenario 2: limited military conflict. In this scenario, Venezuela makes a limited incursion into Essequibo, maybe seizing a border town or an oil installation. Guyana, with US backing, responds with a counterattack. The US provides air support, but stops short of a full-scale invasion. Russia and China condemn the US intervention, but don't directly intervene. The conflict drags on for months, with Venezuela using guerrilla tactics to wear down Guyanese and US forces. This scenario is less likely, but it's not impossible. Maduro is desperate, and desperate leaders make reckless decisions. The US would be forced to respond, but it would be a messy, protracted conflict with no clear winner. And the longer it drags on, the higher the risk of escalation. Scenario 3: full-scale war. This is the nightmare scenario. Venezuela launches a full-scale invasion of Essequibo. The US responds with airstrikes and a ground invasion. Russia and China provide direct military support to Venezuela, turning the conflict into a proxy war. The fighting spreads to other parts of Latin America, with Cuba, Nicaragua, and Bolivia getting involved. The global economy tanks as oil prices skyrocket. And before you know it, we're in a new Cold War, with Latin America as the primary battleground. This scenario is unlikely, but it's not zero. And if it happens, the consequences would be catastrophic. Grand strategy: the folly of liberal hegemony. Now, let's out. Because this crisis isn't just about Venezuela and Guyana. It's about the broader failure of US grand strategy. For the last 30 years, the US has operated under a doctrine of liberal hegemony, the idea that the US should use its military and economic power to spread democracy, free markets, and American values around the world. It's the doctrine that led us into Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and countless other interventions. And it's a doctrine that has failed spectacularly. The problem with liberal hegemony is that it assumes the US can reshape the world in its own image. But the world doesn't work that way. Countries have their own interests, their own histories, their own ambitions. And when the US tries to impose its will, it often ends up creating more problems than it solves. Look at Venezuela. The US has been trying to overthrow Maduro for years. Sanctions, coups, covert operations, nothing has worked. And now, with the Essequibo crisis, we're seeing the consequences of that failure. A weak, isolated regime, backed by Russia and China, is making a desperate gamble to survive. And the US is left scrambling to respond. This is what happens when you try to maintain global dominance in a multipolar world. You stretch yourself too thin. You make enemies. And you end up in crises that could have been avoided with a little humility and restraint. I've been saying this, for the US needs to abandon the fantasy of liberal hegemony and adopt a more realistic. Here's the uncomfortable truth: most policymakers in Washington still don't get it. They cling to the idea that the US can dictate outcomes in Caracas, Moscow, or Beijing through a mix of sanctions, military posturing, and moral grandstanding. But the world has moved on. The unipolar moment is over, and the sooner we accept that, the better we can navigate the dangers ahead. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's move on Essequibo isn't just about oil or territory. It's a calculated test of U.S. resolve in a region where American influence is waning. Maduro isn't acting alone, he's got patrons. Russia has been propping up his regime for years, supplying arms, intelligence, and diplomatic cover at the UN. China, meanwhile, has turned Venezuela into a client state, buying its oil at discounted rates while flooding the country with loans it can never repay. And let's not forget Iran, which has been sending drones, technicians, and even military advisors to Caracas under the guise of technical cooperation. This isn't just a Latin American problem. It's a global one. Because if Venezuela gets away with this, it sets a precedent. Other revisionist powers will take note. If a bankrupt petrostate can redraw borders with impunity, what's stopping China from making a move on Taiwan? Or Russia from doubling down in Ukraine? The rules-based order isn't just being challenged, it's being dismantled, one crisis at a time. Let me explain why this matters for U.S. military strategy. The Pentagon has spent decades preparing for great power competition, but its focus has been overwhelmingly on the Indo-Pacific and Europe. Latin America? That's been an afterthought, a backwater where the biggest threats were drug cartels and leftist populists. But that's changing. Venezuela's military buildup, with Russian S-300 air defense systems, Chinese radars, and Iranian drones, is turning the country into a forward operating base for America's adversaries. And if the U.S. doesn't adjust, it could find itself facing a multi-front challenge it's not prepared for. Here's the thing about military: it's not just about having the best weapons. It's about having the right strategy. And right now, the U.S. is stuck in a Cold War mindset, where every crisis is framed as a binary choice between intervention and appeasement. But the world isn't binary. It's messy, interconnected, and increasingly resistant to American coercion. Take the Essequibo crisis. The U.S. has responded with a mix of diplomatic pressure and military shows of force, sending warships to the region, conducting joint exercises with Guyana, and warning Maduro against further aggression. But these moves are reactive, not strategic. They're designed to deter, not to shape the long-term balance of power. And deterrence only works if the other side believes you're willing to follow through. Maduro doesn't. Because he knows the U.S. is stretched thin, bogged down in Ukraine, facing a potential crisis in the South China Sea, and dealing with a domestic political landscape that's deeply divided over foreign policy. This is where the failure of liberal hegemony becomes glaringly obvious. The U.S. has spent trillions of dollars and countless lives trying to remake the world in its image, only to find itself weaker and more isolated than ever. And now, as the global order fractures, it's scrambling to hold the pieces together. But you can't fix a broken strategy with more of the same. You need something different. So what's the alternative? I've argued for years that the U.S. needs to adopt a grand strategy of offshore balancing, a more restrained approach that focuses on preserving American primacy without trying to police the world. Instead of trying to overthrow every regime we don't like, we should focus on maintaining a favorable balance of power in key regions. Instead of treating every crisis as an existential threat, we should pick our battles carefully. And instead of assuming our allies will always follow our lead, we should recognize that they have their own interests, and sometimes, those interests will diverge from ours. Now, I know what some of you are, but if we pull back, won't our adversaries fill the vacuum? That's the establishment's favorite scare tactic. But here's the reality: our adversaries are already filling the vacuum. Russia and China aren't waiting for us to retreat. They're extending their influence because we've given them openings. Our overstretch has created opportunities for them. And our refusal to accept the limits of our power has made us weaker, not stronger. Let's take Latin America as an example. The U.S. has spent decades trying to isolate Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, only to push them into the arms of Moscow and Beijing. Meanwhile, countries like Brazil and Mexico, traditional U.S. partners, are hedging their bets, forging closer ties with China and even Russia. Why? Because they don't trust Washington to respect their sovereignty. And can you blame them? After decades of coups, sanctions, and military interventions, Latin America has every reason to be skeptical of U.S. intentions. This is the paradox of American power. The more we try to control the world, the less control we actually have. And the more we insist on being the global policeman, the more the world resists our authority. It's a self-defeating cycle, and it's time we broke out of it. So where does that leave us with Venezuela? The immediate crisis may pass and Maduro might back down, the US might broker some temporary deal, and the world will move on. But the underlying dynamics won't change. Venezuela will remain a failed state, a haven for criminal networks, and a forward base for America's adversaries. And unless the US rethinks its approach, we'll be dealing with the consequences for decades to come. The question isn't whether we can stop Venezuela from making reckless moves. The question is whether we can adapt to a world where our influence is no longer absolute. And right now, the answer isn't looking good. Because the establishment in Washington would rather double down on a failed strategy than admit it's time for a new one. And that, my friends, is the real danger. Not Maduro's gambit, but our refusal to see the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's latest move, whether it was the Essequibo gambit or the sudden military exercises near the Colombian border, isn't just about territorial ambition or even oil. It's about survival. And not just Maduro's survival, but the survival of an entire political system that has spent the last decade cannibalizing itself. The Bolivarian Revolution was never just about socialism, it was about power. And power, in Venezuela, has always been about control over the state's last remaining the military's loyalty. Let me explain why this matters. When Chavez first took power in 1999, he didn't just nationalize industries, he nationalized the military's role in the economy. Officers weren't just commanders, they became businessmen, running everything from food imports to oil contracts. By the time Maduro took over in 2013, the military wasn't just a tool of the state, it was the state. And when the economy collapsed, the generals didn't just protect Maduro, they protected their own interests. Today, the military controls an estimated 60% of Venezuela's GDP through shell commies, smuggling networks, and gold mines in the south. That's not ideology. That's institutional self-preservation. Here's the uncomfortable: Maduro isn't clinging to power because he's a true believer in 21st century socialism. He's clinging to power because the alternative is prison or worse. The same goes for the generals. And that's why every time the US or the EU tightens sanctions, every time the opposition talks about amnesty deals, the regime doubles down. Because for them, this isn't about policy. It's about life and death. Now, let's talk about the opposition. Because if you listen to Washington or Brussels, you'd think the biggest threat to Maduro is Maria Corina Machado or the remnants of Juan Guaido's parallel government. But that's not how it works in Caracas. The real threat isn't the opposition, it's the fractures within the regime itself. And those fractures are widening. Take Diosdado Cabello, the former National Assembly president and the regime's second most powerful figure. For years, he and Maduro have been locked in a silent power struggle, with Cabello representing the hardline Chavista old guard and Maduro the more pragmatic faction willing to make deals with the US or even the private sector. Then there's Tarek El Aissami, the former oil minister and alleged drug kingpin, who was quietly sidelined last year after US sanctions made him too toxic even for Maduro. And don't forget the colectivos, the armed civilian militias that act as the regime's enforcers. They're not just loyal to Maduro, they're loyal to the revolution's most radical elements, and they've been known to turn on officials who get too cozy with the opposition. So when Maduro makes a sudden move, like claiming the Essequibo or arresting opposition figures, it's not just about distracting from domestic problems. It's about consolidating power. Every time he does this, he forces the factions within the regime to rally around him or risk being purged. And every time the US responds with sanctions or threats, it plays right into his hands. Because nothing unites a fractured regime like an external enemy. But here's where it gets really dangerous. The regime's survival strategy has always relied on repression at home and foreign patrons abroad. For years, that meant Cuba, Russia, and China. But Cuba is broke, Russia is distracted by Ukraine, and China, while still happy to buy Venezuelan oil, has made it clear it won't bail out the regime. That leaves Maduro with fewer options than ever. And when desperate leaders run out of options, they take risks. That's why I'm not surprised by the recent military buildup near the Colombian border. Colombia is Venezuela's most immediate geopolitical rival, and President Gustavo Petro, a leftist who has tried to distance himself from Washington, has been pushing for dialogue with Maduro. But Petro's government is also home to former FARC guerrillas, and Venezuela has long been a safe haven for Colombian armed groups. If Maduro feels cornered, he might decide to escalate tensions with Colombia as a way to rally nationalist sentiment at home. And if that happens, the US will have to do we back Petro, who's already skeptical of American influence, or do we risk pushing him closer to Maduro? Then there's the domestic angle. The Venezuelan economy is in shambles, but it's not as simple as sanctions caused the collapse. The truth is more complicated. Yes, US sanctions on PDVSA have crippled oil exports, but Venezuela's oil production was already in freefall before 2019 because of corruption and mismanagement. The real killer has been hyperinflation, which peaked at over 1,000,000% in 2018. The bolivar is worthless, and most transactions happen in dollars when they happen at all. The government has tried to stabilize the economy with dollarization and limited market reforms, but those reforms are half-hearted at best. Because if Maduro fully liberalizes the economy, he risks losing control of the military's economic empire. And that's a risk he can't take. So what's the endgame? The most likely scenario is more of the slow-motion collapse, punctuated by periodic crises that force the regime to lash out. Maduro will keep making deals with the US when it suits him, like the 2023 oil for debt swap with Chevron, and then backtrack when it doesn't. The opposition will keep trying to unify, but without the military's support, they're powerless. And the US will keep oscillating between sanctions and diplomacy, never committing to either. But there's a darker possibility. If the regime feels truly cornered, if the US tightens sanctions further, if the military fractures, if the economy collapses completely, Maduro might decide to go all in on a nationalist gamble. That could mean a full-scale invasion of the Essequibo, a military confrontation with Colombia, or even a desperate alliance with Iran or North Korea. None of these are likely, but none are impossible. And if any of them happen, the US will be forced to respond. And that's when things get really messy. Because here's the thing about it's not just a failed state. It's a failed state with nukes, or at least, the potential for them. Venezuela has one of the world's largest uranium reserves, and in 2008, Chavez signed a nuclear cooperation deal with Russia. The program was supposedly for peaceful purposes, but given Venezuela's history of arms deals with Iran and North Korea, it's not hard to imagine where that could lead. Now, I'm not saying Maduro is about to build a bomb. But if he feels like he has nothing left to lose, he might decide to play the nuclear card as a way to force the US to the negotiating table. That's the nightmare scenario. And it's not as far-fetched as it sounds. Because when you're a leader with no way out, you don't think in terms of probabilities. You think in terms of survival. And Maduro has already shown he's willing to do whatever it takes to stay in power. So where does that leave us? The US needs to stop treating Venezuela like a problem to be solved and start treating it like a reality to be managed. That means accepting that Maduro isn't going anywhere anytime soon. It means working with regional partners like Brazil and Mexico to contain the crisis, rather than trying to isolate Venezuela. And it means recognizing that every time we tighten the screws, we're not just hurting Maduro, we're hurting the Venezuelan people, who are already suffering more than anyone. But most of all, it means admitting that our approach has failed. Because if we keep doing the same thing and expecting different results, we're not just delusional, we're dangerous. And in a world where the rules are changing, that's a luxury we can't afford. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the death of the post-Cold War order. For 30 years, we've operated under the assumption that failed states were problems to be fixed, not realities to be managed. We invaded Iraq to bring democracy, we toppled Gaddafi to protect civilians, and we sanctioned Venezuela into oblivion because we assumed economic pain would force political change. But here's the uncomfortable: none of it worked. The world didn't become more stable. It became more fragmented. And Venezuela is just the latest case study in why our grand strategy is broken. Let me explain why this matters beyond Caracas. The US has spent the last decade pivoting to Asia, treating Latin America as an afterthought. But geography doesn't care about our priorities. Venezuela shares a border with Colombia, a NATO partner. It sits atop the largest oil reserves on the planet. And it's now openly flirting with the same revisionist powers we're trying to contain in the Indo-Pacific: Russia, China, Iran. You don't need a PhD in geopolitics to see the problem here. If we ignore Venezuela, we're not just ceding influence in our own hemisphere. We're creating a vacuum that our adversaries will fill. Take China, for example. In 2023 alone, Beijing extended a $5 billion line of credit to Caracas, secured long-term oil contracts at below-market rates, and even deployed military advisors to help modernize Venezuela's aging Russian equipment. That's not charity. That's a strategic bet. China isn't just propping up Maduro, it's building a client state in America's backyard. And if you think that doesn't have implications for Taiwan or the South China Sea, you're not paying attention. Then there's Russia. Remember when Putin sent 2 nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela in 2018? That wasn't a stunt. It was a signal. Moscow has been deepening its military ties with Caracas for years, selling billions in arms, training Venezuelan troops, and even floating the idea of a permanent Russian naval base on the Caribbean coast. Now, I'm not saying we're on the brink of a Cuban Missile Crisis 2.0. But I am saying that if we keep treating Venezuela as a second-tier issue, we're going to wake up one day and realize we've lost control of our own neighborhood. So what's the alternative? First, we need to stop pretending that regime change is still on the table. The 2019 maximum pressure campaign failed. The 2020 election interference failed. The 2023 sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector failed. Maduro isn't going anywhere, and every time we double down on these tactics, we push him further into the arms of our adversaries. That doesn't mean we have to recognize his government, it means we need to be smarter about how we engage. Second, we need to work with the region, not against it. Brazil's Lula has been pushing for a negotiated solution, and Mexico's López Obrador has positioned himself as a mediator. Both countries have leverage with Maduro that we don't. Instead of dismissing them as soft-on dictators, we should be coordinating with them. Because here's the if we don't, someone else will. And that someone else is likely to be China. Third, we need to get serious about energy diplomacy. Venezuela's oil reserves are a strategic asset, not just an economic one. If we keep squeezing its oil sector, we're not just hurting Maduro, we're driving up global prices and handing China a monopoly on Venezuelan crude. That's a lose-lose. A better approach? Conditional sanctions relief. Let Venezuela sell oil, but only if the proceeds go toward humanitarian aid and democratic reforms. It's not perfect, but it's better than the status quo. Now, I can already hear the objections. But what about human rights? What about democracy? Those are valid concerns. But here's the hard: we can't promote democracy if we're not in the room. And right now, we're not in the room. China is. Russia is. Iran is. If we want to have any influence over Venezuela's future, we need to stop treating it as a pariah and start treating it as a problem to be managed. Let me be, I'm not advocating for appeasement. I'm advocating for realism. The world is changing, and our strategy needs to change with it. We can't afford to keep pretending that Venezuela is just another failed state. It's a geopolitical black hole, and if we don't adjust our approach, we're going to get sucked in. So where does that leave us? With a choice. We can keep doing what we've always done and watch as Venezuela becomes a permanent crisis. Or we can adapt, engage, and try to shape the outcome before it's too late. The first option is easy. The second is hard. But in a world where the rules are being rewritten, hard is the only option that makes sense. Because here's the final uncomfortable: Venezuela isn't just a test of Maduro's survival. It's a test of ours. And if we fail, it won't just be Caracas that pays the price. It'll be all of us.